Winner. You're watching the Women's Rugby Show.
Hello, and welcome back to the Women's Rugby Show. I'm Sam Bardo, and today I'm here with a very special edition of the show. With the British and Irish Lions tour to South Africa currently ongoing, I thought of nothing better than to bring a Lions special, a two-part Lions special may I add, to the Women's Rugby Show. You may be asking, Sam, what's that got to do with women's rugby? But here I am to tell you. I've been looking at how a women's British and Irish Lions tour could happen and how it could be run, from where the Lions could go to play and who will make up the squad. And that's what I'm going to bring you in this two-part special. So before we get into the special, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the Women's Rugby Show on YouTube, and check us out across all social medias as well. If you've done all that, well, let's get into the video. An issue that got raised to me about this British and Irish Lions tour, a women's British and Irish Lions tour, is who exactly the Lions would be able to play. I thought there would be three candidates: New Zealand, USA and Canada. And in my eyes, I've split these up into two different places, starting off with New Zealand and then moving to USA and Canada, split into two tours. So a New Zealand tour and then an America tour to USA and Canada. And I'm going to run through these fixtures for you. So I think the obvious destination, or one of the obvious destinations for a women's British and Irish Lions tour, would be New Zealand. I think this is because rugby is obviously massive in New Zealand. Also, the World Cup is going to be there next year in 2022 after being postponed from this year. And I think to have a Lions tour there after the World Cup would be massive for both British rugby, British women's rugby, and also New Zealand women's rugby. The game will have grown so much from having all those world-class athletes there. Fans will be wanting to go watch rugby. Have you seen across all kind of sports recently, if something happens good in a country, then everything will want to grow from there. So having a women's Lions tour there would be obvious. And also, if you look at the tour schedule that's on the screen, we have 10 games, 7 tour matches and 3 test matches. And I think this is to promote and be able to have rugby across New Zealand, across both islands, without also minimising travel as well. I think that's massive. We don't want to be able to be flying everywhere. We don't want to have the issue of money in terms of flights and travel as well. So let's get into who they actually would play. Game 1 would be against North Harbour in the North Island, before playing Auckland also in the North Island as well in Game 2. Before travelling down a little bit, sticking in North Island to play Bay of Plenty in Game 3. Then Game 4 in Wellington as we move further down North Island, before flying over to the South Island to play Canterbury in Game 5. And finally, Game 6, we move further down into the North Island at the Forsyth Bar Stadium to play Otago, and this will be the last game before the first test against the Black Ferns, which also would be at the Forsyth Bar Stadium. This is to make sure that we're having plenty of games across both islands. We've had, obviously, the first 4 games of the tour on the North Island, then Game 5, 6 and 7 in the South Island, including one of the tests at the Forsyth Bar Stadium, which what has happened in the past with the men's Lions tour as well. Obviously then we have a midweek game before the second and third test. This will be back up in the North Island in Counties Manawatu, before playing the second test at the Rotorua Stadium, and then the final test at the big one, Eden Park. And I think it'll be massive for the women's game, to have a full test at Eden Park, big crowds, to end what would be a successful British and Irish Lions tour to New Zealand. And here is the second potential British and Irish Lions tour, this time to USA and Canada. I must admit before we get into this one that this is a slightly bit more complicated than New Zealand, due to having 2 different test series essentially, first against the USA and then against Canada. And obviously this is to have the game spread far and wide, playing both teams and also allowing the Lions to play competitive games against both as well, which would be good for USA and Canada and also the British nations. And we're starting off this tour in New York on the east coast of USA. And I think that would be massive to play a game in New York, start the tour in New York where there could be potential to grow the game to new fans, before moving to Atlanta Harlequins for Game 2, then Chicago North Shore for Game 3. These first games has kind of minimised travel. There's not a lot of travel happening in these ones, and I think that's really important. It means there's not too much going on, not too much travel, and it allows also to minimise costs, but also allows fans to travel without having too much cost for them travelling as well. Game 4 is where we moved to the West Coast to San Diego to play the San Diego Surfers before playing the Berkeley All Blues in California. I think this would be one of the biggest games of the tour. California is massive, it's a tourist destination, and I think for travelling fans it would be brilliant to go and watch a rugby game in California. It'll be great for Berkeley to play a competitive team, a British and Irish Lions team as well, to help grow the game there, and also just to have a commercially viable option to play a rugby game, a British and Irish Lions game in California. As we've seen with Ireland playing over in America numerous times, it's been massive for them. There's been great crowds, and also we've seen in football as well, growing, having massive crowds out there as well. And then finally, the final game of the tour series is against the Glendale Merlins in Denver, Colorado, and that's where we play our first test, actually our first two tests of the tour. Game 7 and Game 8, both against the USA, and both at Infinity Park in Colorado. And I think Infinity Park is one of the best stadiums for women's rugby out there. It's small, it's compact, and it's also really important for the USA. It's used to be their unofficial home of both the men's team, and I think to have the Women's Lions Tour hosted there will be massive for not just the USA to have. It'll be quite illustrious for them to play there, and also it was where the first Barbarians game was, and I think having the first Lions test there against the USA, and also at the place where the first Barbarians game was, would be kind of like women's rugby has gone full circle. So we've got two tests there before we fly over to Canada, to Toronto, to play the first test at BMO Field in Toronto, and then moving to BC Place in Vancouver for the second test. And the reason I've scheduled it like this, to have two different test series, is, like I mentioned earlier, to have those competitive games against two nations, but also to help grow those two nations as well. I think it'll be unfair to leave Canada out of the Women's British and Irish Lions being in North America, so I think it's important to play both of those games. When I was discussing this British and Irish Lions tour, someone raised a point to me about a potential another tourist destination. So big shout out to Matt for this idea, but that was a Southern Hemisphere Barbarians. And the tour could be in New Zealand and Australia, and then you could play against a load of tour teams, against all the New Zealand provincial teams that we just mentioned, also some Australian provincial teams. But you could also have this Southern Hemisphere Barbarian side, a 3-test series against players from New Zealand, Australia, the Pacific Islands, South Africa, Argentina. You could have all sorts in there, and it'll become a massive opposition for the Lions, and it will be more financially viable because you'll have the impact from all of those Southern Hemisphere unions as well. I think instead of just playing New Zealand or just playing the USA and Canada, it'll become more financially viable for the Lions, and it'll also bring more investment into the game through getting all these unions involved. And I think it will also engage the crowds more, and I think that's the most important thing about a potential British and Irish Lions tour. So there you have it, the potential fixtures for a women's British and Irish Lions tour to New Zealand, to the USA and Canada, and also an idea to go to New Zealand and Australia for a Southern Hemisphere Barbarians tour. I think a women's British and Irish Lions tour would be brilliant for the women's game. We all know that the women's rugby is one of the fastest growing sports, the fastest growing sport in the world, and in 5-6 years' time it's going to be massive. I think a women's British and Irish Lions tour will be key, will be vital for the growth of the game. We've seen with the women's Barbarians when they play some of those fixtures against Munster, Wales, England, in the USA as well. It's been really important for the growth of the game. We've seen that. We've seen having them side by side play that Wales game and play that England game, how important it was for those women's game and women's sport in general. A massive thank you